All right, as folks continue to join our webinar, we're going to get started with some introductions before we dive into today's topic. Thank you all for joining us today. For those that join us for the first time, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to this community of practice and what we hope to accomplish together in the next hour. For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name is Carlos Diaz. I'm a director at Hathaway Communications. And along with my colleagues at Hathaway, we serve as the secretariat for the STAT communications community. This community grew out of the work of the State and Territory Alliance for Testing, a group of states and territories convened by the Rockefeller Foundation, who share insights, best practices, and successful strategies and lessons learned on all aspects of the COVID response. The goal of this community and the goal for expanding it and the motivation for these biweekly meetings, as they have been for almost a year now, is to bring the same spirit of collaboration that has made STAT such a success to the broader community working on COVID communications. A second motivation is to bring the same rigor and science that informs other aspects of the response to strategic communications. So you'll know how important it is. That's why we're particularly excited about today's conversation with the Latino Anti-Disinformation Lab, a project between Voto Latino, the nation's largest Latinx US voter registration and engagement organization, and Media Matters for America, a nonprofit misinformation watchdog. It was founded to establish the systems and networks necessary to monitor and help combat the malicious disinformation aimed at the Latino community, which is harming our public health. So today I'm very excited to present our two panelists for today's conversations. We have Maria Teresa Kumar. Maria Teresa is the founding CEO of Voto Latino and Voto Latino Foundation, and an Emmy-nominated honor analyst for MSNBC. And as the country's largest Latinx voter registration and mobilization organization, Voto Latino has played a decisive role in American elections and has been a major voice countering disinformation in the Latino community. Maria Teresa has dedicated her career to engaging the public to build democracy and protect human rights. And the organization Voto Latino has really pioneered the use of technology, including artificial intelligence, best practices in data modeling, social media, and celebrity influencers to effectively register voters and counter disinformation at unprecedented scale. And we also have with us here today, Angelo Carusone. Angelo is President and Chief Executive Officer of Media Matters. He joined Media Matters in 2010. He's also served as the Deputy CEO for Finance and Administration of the 2016 Democratic National Convention. Angelo is an expert on right-wing extremism and has become a go-to resource for journalists writing about disinformation. He is a recognized authority on brand safety and advertising, as well as a prolific organizer who has led many high-profile corporate campaigns. Notably, Angelo launched the viral hashtag Dump Trump campaign 2012 that convinced Macy's to terminate its business partnership with Donald Trump. So we're going to hear from both of them on the following topics: the research using Media Matters infrastructure to track disinformation in traditional and online media, arming partners to fight against disinformation to create a well-informed legion of progressive advocacy organizations, and Voto Latino's own strategic communications campaign, including a hyper-targeted paid media campaign. As we go through the next hour, I encourage you all to leave your thoughts, experiences, and questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat box, whichever one you prefer. Just one thing, if you're sharing in the chat, please put with panelists and attendees in your selection so we can all learn from each other. And we will be gathering questions as we go. The format for today's conversation, we have a Q&A to share with Maria Teresa and Angelo, and then we'll be gathering questions as we go and share those towards the end. So maybe let's start the conversation by getting more background of this really super interesting and amazing initiative. Maybe Angelo, with you first, tell me a little bit more about the new Latino Anti-Disinformation Lab that you both have started and why you thought it was imperative to launch the lab this year.
So, I mean, a big part of the lab is designed to sort of put eyes and ears in a place where right now there's not any eyes and ears. There's Media Matters, there's a whole range of fact checkers, there's investments from tech platforms and news outlets that are all thinking about the problem of misinformation, how you can correct it at the trench warfare level, the day-to-day, how you're thinking about the larger systemic stuff. And one of the big problems that's out there is that the larger Latino information landscape does not have any kind of systemic or concerted or infrastructure that's designed to both identify not just misinformation, but disinformation, which is intentional efforts to sow misinformation through inauthentic means, cheating, and exploit it. And so a big part of the lab, at least the genesis of it, is to say, let's build some infrastructure so we can get eyes and ears in the places where we know that these disinformation efforts are starting. We know there are intentional efforts to exploit this vulnerability in the landscape. And then beyond that, the reason I think why it's a lab, and then I'll turn over to Teresa, is that there's a recognition, a deep one, that how you solve this problem is beyond just responding to and fact checking, that you're going to need to do a whole range of innovation in order to think about and develop the tools for communication and some experimentation. What's going to be the most effective way of dealing with and neutralizing misinformation that's spread already, not just identifying, but then snuffing out disinformation efforts. How do you make them less powerful, less potent, so that they don't lead to the kinds of harms that ultimately get externalized when you have disinformation efforts? I mean, it doesn't matter what the issue is, right? It's politics or political campaigns or public health initiatives. How the media, and in this case, that is news outlets all the way down to social media platforms to individuals on social media, how the media handles anything is going to greatly affect the outcome. And so we know that this is an area that's being exploited. We know there's a great need. And the idea behind the lab is to put together the resources to identify it and then to actually begin to develop mechanisms so that a lot of those harms don't fully materialize. We have some catching up to do, but that's really the genesis of it. And then I'll turn it over to Maria Teresa.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you for the opportunity to have this platform, Rockefeller Center. I think that one of the things that we recognize is that this is perhaps one of the biggest threats to our democracy. And so when we started at Voto Latino, seeing the disinformation, I oftentimes would ask the best in the business, with Angelo, of what are you seeing? And so it made perfect sense right after the end of the election to do something more about it that was far more strategic. In 2016, we had roughly about 4 celebrity voices talking about the issues of disinformation because we started seeing it, but we didn't really know how to tackle it. We decided that in 2020, we enlisted over 267 different voices, individuals that had small Instagram followings of 3,000 to Selena Gomez, who had 62 million. And that was only to share information about what was the right thing to do when it came to voting. In 2016, we had seen, for example, people paying targeted ads to the Latino community with a picture of Hillary Clinton saying, text to vote, don't stand in line. Now, we all know that you cannot text to vote, right? So like that was a lie, and it wasn't being taken down. And so in preparation for that, that's why we enlisted so many followers, but then we also enlisted the folks of Nike and Sony, again, to create inoculation. But speaking with Angelo, speaking to Tom Perez at the time, this just wasn't enough. And that we needed actually to create a place for us to solely focus on Latinos, because we are oftentimes, first, we're early adopters of information and technology use. Voto Latino started talking and texting to people back in 2006 because we knew that's where we were. We started our digital first campaign because we knew that that's how Latinos communicate. We also sadly seem to be the first people to be experimented upon when it comes to messages. And we recognize that if we can identify the epicenters of those messages early on, not only could we stem them, but we could also, ideally, the purpose of the lab is to make people, give the people the ability, the agency to identify bad information so that it doesn't spread, and so that they become peer-to-peer advocates for their family members, telling them what is real and what isn't. Just in this last couple of months that we've been working together with Angelo, the proliferation of disinformation, not just around COVID, but increasingly around political candidates, increasingly around what we're seeing coming, the drive of immigrants coming that we're sadly seeing with Haitian immigrants now coming to the border. Those have been driven by disinformation. And so we need to be able to actually have a space that we can learn, but then most importantly, share out so that we can help the community abroad. So the idea is that Voto Latino, Media Matters flags the information. We test the information for what the right messages work, and then we send it back out into the world, but ideally that we send it out with stakeholders at the local level so that community groups can also be part of the answer.
Fascinating. And wondering what is it that both Media Matters and Voto Latino bring to the table to make the lab so effective and work? But it sounds like such a well-oiled machine by now. Maybe let's start with Angelo first.
Sure. I mean, what Media Matters does is we live monitor. So somebody's sitting there as it's being broadcast, 55,000 hours of television, radio, streams a year. And then we archive and analyze about 1 million hours more. So we have both an infrastructure that's doing these recordings and then are searching them, making them accessible, analyzing them. And we actually have people that sort of go through it in a methodical way, not just listening to it, but looking for patterns, trends, because I think that's the part that makes this really significant. It's one thing when you're dealing with just misinformation, false narratives, false stories that are beginning to spread. When you're dealing with disinformation, it's different. There's a lot more intentionality behind it. The stakes are higher because the front end investment is higher. And what that means is that by the time it's already spread and saturated, if it's a real disinformation effort, the damage will be done. And what you really need to do with disinformation is identify it as early as possible. It's like a tornado, right? The earlier you get it, the faster you can get to shelter. It's the same thing here. The faster you can identify the ingredients, the indicia of a disinformation effort, you can actually begin to respond to it and develop strategies and actually act on strategies. So what we do is we take that previous, both the infrastructure, which is a significant investment in resources and time and know-how, and then expand that out to the places that are uniquely, part of the Latinx information landscape. And that means more peer-to-peer. A lot more of that is what is happening on WhatsApp, which is a messaging service and device, a network of YouTube programs in particular, but also local, especially Spanish language talk radio, which is picking up storylines and putting it out into the ecosystem. And so basically taking that monitoring infrastructure and that research infrastructure, expanding it out to incorporate it in a very deliberate way, not just sort of adjacent or ad hoc, but in a scaled, meaningful, and lasting, deliberate way, the capacity to do that for the parts of the information landscape where Latinos are most active. And that's the first real ingredient. So it's monitoring, and then it's research, and a little bit of context for sort of separating out the wheat from the chaff, which are the campaigns that are actually going to be more harmful or risky than others. And then the other part of the lab is what Voto Latino really brings their expertise to. I'll turn it over to Maria Teresa. Yeah, sorry.
No, so I think that it's, Angela, I think you've heard a lot of it. I think, oftentimes people will ask, well, why is Voto Latino in this space? And frankly, our job at Voto Latino is enfranchisement and democracy building. And if you were to ask me, what are the 2 issues right now that are of concern at Voto Latino that we consider code red, is a disenfranchisement from the voting booth. We're seeing this across the country with over 400 pieces of legislation introduced at the state level governments to disenfranchise, particularly communities of color. And the other piece, the other most dangerous piece for our democracy is having the erosion of our institutions, of people not trusting their government, of people not trusting the institutions of democracy. And so when we demonstrate, and we'll talk a little bit about what we did around COVID, if at a basic level, if the Latino community, which has high vaccine hesitancy, in part because they're receiving bad information around COVID, if they truly believe that the government is trying to insert microchips into their bodies and control them, what's going to make sure that that same person is going to go out and vote? They're not, right? And so we take this, so for us at Voto Latino, the reason that we're piloting a lot of this stuff is that we're actually trying to better understand what is preventing participation in our democracy building, what is preventing people from going out and actually engaging in government so that they can have the democracy that we believe in. And as Angelo has noted, we're seeing a lot of this stuff coming in from the very far right, but we're also seeing foreign actors. I'll just share one anecdotal conversation of how widespread and how well funded and orchestrated this is. I happened to be in Colombia during the unrest this past April. I was vaccinated, my family was vaccinated, and we were doing a reunion with my mother and my grandmother and my mother-in-law. And so in Cartagena, and during that time, that's when the arrest in Colombia happened. And what was trending on Twitter was a lot of this anti-socialism messaging, militarization of the police, pro-militarization of the police, just to give you an idea of what the sentiment was there. And one video caught my eye. and I flagged it for Angelo. And it was this raw footage of someone on the border of Venezuela and Colombia, not on camera, interviewing a father. And you knew he was a father because he had a little kid's backpack. And you could tell he was desperate. And the question that they asked him, that at least that they clipped, was, in America, everybody wants socialism. You're fleeing socialism. Tell us why. And it was raw. And I remember telling Angelo, Angelo, I just saw this clip and I wonder what they're going to use it for, because it just seemed raw. Long story short, we were preparing for a conversation with Ambassador Rice to talk about this very issue. And that day, as I was prepping, I found the video. And it was it was embedded in an 8-minute explainer by Prager University about socialism and how we cannot trust that kind of system here in our country. It was mind-blowing because it basically gave the dotted line of that they are investing, going into the most desperate situations, trying to get footage and then repackaging it to an American audience.
Wow. That's fascinating. Angelo, you have been monitoring this information for years, and there may not be anyone on earth who really knows more about right-wing disinformation than you and your organization.
And he's still with us, Angelo.
Yes, I know you all watch hours and hours of footage to analyze all that, but I'm wondering, from your initial research, tell us, how is disinformation that's targeted at Spanish speakers different from some of the disinformation non-Spanish speaker might be more used to? Are the players and bad actors generally the same, or do they differ in any ways?
So the one thing that I would say is that it is different. And it's different and it's not just different in the way that it's distributed and on the user side, and also on some of the bad actor side that's pushing it. But I think one of the things that makes this difference extremely relevant to the future is that it's almost always an indication of where the rest of the media landscape is going to go.
Yeah.
And Maria Teresa referenced this earlier about how, when they were starting, that they were focusing so much on text back in 2006, which was ahead of the curve, because that's where there was such an enormous amount of Latino users they could target and organize. The same thing is applied very consistently in the media landscape, that traditionally and consistently, the Latinx information landscape is basically, a couple years ahead of where the rest of the media is going to be. And that is everything with how information is distributed, how users are going to actually consume it. Is it going to be more mobile first? Are they going to be looking at two screens at the same time? Is it going to be more peer-to-peer? So it's relevant not just in this moment in addressing the direct problem, but it also is going to give us a sense of where everything's going. And that means that when you look at the right-wing investments, even just the bad actor investments that they're making here, if it's that the effects of what they're doing is not just going to lead to the immediate harms from the disinformation, but it also means that they're refining the tactics, the tools, and the capacities to then scale those efforts more broadly to the rest of the information landscape. So what we're basically seeing is a small peek into the broader fight for the rest of the landscape. And here's what it looks like. And it also makes it uniquely more challenging, which is that one thing that is really different is that in disinformation in the Latinx space is much more peer-to-peer. So, you could point to a few Tucker Carlsons in the media landscape, say, okay, I know that when he talked about that COVID conspiracy theory, or he pushed that was a center of gravity, that so much of it could be connected to that. There are not that many major right-wing influencers in the rest of the media landscape, and so much of it is centered around them. They're gravitational forces. Whether they talk about something is really going to be a defining characteristic of how much it spreads, how fast it can spread, and how damaging the harms are going to be. That just doesn't exist in the Latinx landscape. So number one, there are no major centers of gravity. That's the first thing. The second is that it's much more peer-to-peer oriented. And what that means from the disinformation context is that you have a lot of groups, small family groups, friends on WhatsApp, on Telegram to some extent, some Facebook messengers, and they're taking content ideas and they are either forwarding messages from other groups, or forwarding content, or they're just posting it in there and sharing it. They're talking about it. And that is both much more atomized, much more fragmented, that the audiences are smaller. So that means that not only is it harder to spread information, but it's harder to correct it because you can't reach them, and it's harder to monitor it. And what the right has done is they've taken or what we've seen in the disinformation context is to exploit these vulnerabilities. Not to try to build a new mega infrastructure, but to embrace it. So one example is we've seen a massive proliferation of YouTube accounts that are basically producing shows. And what they do is take content from already existing right-wing outlets or other disreputable outlets, and they basically package an entire show around 1 or 2 news articles. And they obviously tailor it and customize it to the audience that they're speaking to. But the whole idea there is not to build a massive YouTube following of millions of subscribers. It's to produce the content that then gets posted into not just one family or friend WhatsApp group, but dozens or hundreds, right? To actually produce the content that's going to be much more, that's going to help fill those conversations in the peer-to-peer network. And then the second vulnerability that we've seen is that it's really hard to trace it. It takes us almost no time. Oftentimes, when we're finding a story that's starting to bubble up, we can find back the beginning. Where did Tucker Carlson get that latest thing they talked about today? Oh, okay. You go back, you food chain it, you can find it. One of the differences in the Latinx space is that you have to think of it's much more broad. It's an international context. And what we've seen is a laundering of disinformation through seemingly reputable places or just unknowns. So one of the biggest things we saw with COVID early on, after we started the lab, we went back and said, okay, what does this landscape look like? And we found a series of really, really major stories that had spread fast around COVID disinformation. What it basically said was that a few healthcare workers had sudden death the moment they got the vaccine. And that story was laundered through a series of seemingly legitimate sounding publications coming out of Bolivia and other countries that they were fabrications. They were just like we were dealing with the fake news crisis in 2016, but they were then repeated over and over and over again as anecdotes on these WhatsApp groups. And no one can really trace the source. And one of the things that matters when you're trying to show that something is discredited is to go right to say, oh, this came from just some random person, or that's not a real outlet. It's a lot harder to do in that space. And what we've seen is a genuine intentional exploitation of that vulnerability. So on the one hand, there's been investment to build out the communications channels and the content that can be distributed peer-to-peer. And then on the other hand, there's been an exploitation of that complicated, sort of much more smaller atomized vulnerability to produce that ground level content that's not just going to make its way into the peer groups, but it's actually going to get picked up on a local Spanish talk radio, which then makes it feel much more valid and legitimate. And those two things are basically the broad context that we're dealing with, aside from what the individual narratives look like. And those structures is where all the trends are pointing us to a much more fragmented peer-to-peer atomized media landscape. And so, that's why you're hearing a lot less about some of these major talk radio hosts increasingly and more about some of these other podcast channels that you may not have ever paid attention to, because that's where the trend lines are pointing. So big picture, that's the challenge, that they see the landscape and they're exploiting it on purpose.
Yeah, it's really amazing to watch you break it down, how that peer-to-peer sharing information that happens in the Latino community. Just this morning, I can look at my WhatsApp group of my extended Mexican family, and I already have seen 10 disinformation videos being shared. So yeah, really fascinating hearing you break all that down. Maybe let's take a deeper look at how this information is actually impacting our country and its people. I know there has been a lot of disinformation about COVID vaccine. We were just referencing a few minutes ago. Maria Teresa, maybe you want to share more about that?
Sure. So we recognize that disinformation is a big problem. I will tell you that similar to your Mexican family chain, I am on one as well, with a Colombian tint from Northern California. So, and right around December, when the vaccine was being dealt to healthcare workers, my mother is in the healthcare industry. And so she was going to have access to some of the very first dosage, and they were going to come to her facility because she takes care of elderly people. And she told me that she wasn't going to take it. And I was surprised because my mother has always made sure that I was vaccinated, that she was vaccinated. We take the flu shot, all of it. And it took me about 7 weeks, Carlos, for her to finally tell me that it was because a friend at the gym had been forwarding her WhatsApp messages And it was very much, I said, well, why don't you send them to me so I can figure out, like, as anyone who knows me, I like to do my research first before I basically try to figure out how to break you down. So send me your information, Mom. And so I started looking at the videos, and there was one that stood out that has been widely publicized, but it was this woman who was from El Salvador. She was sitting down talking to a group. She had on a lab coat. And for people who really understand colorism in the Latino space, she presented white and with great authority and a very great grasp of English, of Spanish, and was basically saying that we should not take the COVID vaccine because it was a technology never introduced into humans before. And that had been forwarded several times over. I was finally able to ask my mom, well, where did your friend from the gym get it? And she said, well, she got it from her brother in Houston. And this is where the web becomes very interesting, right? So the woman from her gym friend was not from El Salvador. The brother was not related to anybody in El Salvador. And my mother is from Colombia, right? So it was just like this orchestrated effort. And we ended up using some of that as that was my own personal story. And there's millions of Latinos who are having these conversations. And I would say that in particular, it's kind of us in the middle, the ones that are not the Gen Zers or millennials. And it's not the older folks, because we're actually not online as much as the polar of the populations. It's the younger set that are really online, and it's the older folks that are really online. And so one of the things that we did is we actually created a study. So finding the information that Angelo was sending to us, we actually ended up doing a survey trying to figure out how many people suspected to have seen Facebook misinformation around COVID in the survey. And we found that close to 60% had been able to self-identify information served up to them. That number must be higher, because if you believe that what you're watching is real, you won't be able to self-identify. So that was one. We also found that many of roughly 40% of the Latinos didn't think that getting the vaccine was going to be effective. And so we identified, well, where do you lie on the spectrum? Are you down the rabbit hole of disinformation where you're never going to get it? Or are you kind of like more on the wait and see category? And so we focused our work and our research on creating content for the wait and see category. Let me show you 2 videos. I think that they might be on deck of what we did.
Yes. Caroline, are you sharing those? Mm-hmm.
I feel so much safer coming to work every day after getting the vaccine. When I got the vaccine, I had a feeling of euphoria, and knowing that we can begin to get society back to normal. We've been living these crazy lives now for over a year. And when all of my students are back in this classroom, they're going to be happier, they're going to learn better, and they're going to be more motivated. The vaccine didn't even hurt. I was a little sore, but other than that, nothing.
And so we did experiments on this in 3 different ways. One, we served them up through Facebook. The other, we put it in field. And one, we did a control study through using Ad Council as a control. And every single one, the ads were had high rates of efficacy. But this is what we learned. Normally about the Latino, we've had the tendency and the reputation of using high profile individuals. For this, we actually tested over 15 different types of ads to find out who was the best messenger. And we narrowed it down to 2 people. And they were the most authentic. They were not part of the healthcare industry. They were telling their personal stories, and they were able to meet people where they were. One of the things that we surfaced that people were hesitant was that it was going to hurt, that it was going to make them basically get sick, and they were going to miss days of work, and that it was going to keep them from, and that they were going to have to pay for it. So you notice that all of the ads that we ended up using, always at the end, it says, get the COVID vaccine, it's free. Mm-hmm. The other woman that did very well, and it was dependent very much on gender. The one that really moved women, her name was Adriana. The setting is in the field, in the back. You can see a tractor, and she has a slight accent, and she says, "I'm getting the COVID vaccine because I know 10 people who have died." Mm. This is her story. And it really resonated. To make a long story short, when we measured this in a control group, the people that saw our ad versus the ad council ad, the ad council moved people roughly 2.8 points. Our ad moved them at least 6.7 points, if not more. When we took it into the real world, the people that saw it, we did a partnership with Google. Google basically, what a lot of our stuff that we do is basically taking the best practices of corporate America when it comes to marketing, and we market it for democracy. In this case, we marketed it for the Get the COVID vaccine. And so we did a real world program where we showed these ads with YouTube in California, Texas, and in Florida, areas we identified population zip codes of Latinos that had low vaccination rates. We purposely ran the ads in June and July, because by that time, everybody who would have taken the vaccine who wanted to would have. This was definitely, so we identified areas that basically had low vaccination rates among Latinos in a time period after they should have already taken them, in a long story short. And we showed them, and then Google tracked them roughly for 10 days to see what their behavior would be. And that is more to see, what did they look for? Did they look for the vaccine? We found that the people who looked at a Voto Latino vaccine ad were 54 times more likely to search the term, get COVID vaccine.
Wow.
It was huge. Google semi-joked saying that they had to do their math thrice because they couldn't believe it. They had never seen such an uptick. And so one of the things it tells us is that the research that Angelo is doing is not just research, it's applicable, that we could actually create interventions with content, with direct advertising, with conversations, because the other thing that taught us is that Latinos are not getting information from the people they trust. The person that did the worst of all these tests that we did, Carlos, was actually the physician. No one wanted to talk to the physician. People wanted to talk to someone who felt like they were feeling the same insecurities as they were, and the same trepidation, and then at the same time, feeling that they were normal and they weren't being judged. And so we did the same program with Facebook, where we identified people who watched a video, and they watched the video, and then we asked them a survey, and it said sponsored content by Voto Latino. And the people, and so we had a category, and it's a little harder because I don't have the slides, but we basically were able to move people to that from the I don't know if the vaccine is safe to I know it is safe. And it jumped up 2.8 percentage points. It doesn't sound like a lot, but over 1.2 million people saw that video.
Yeah.
So it's significant. So it talks about the importance of learning what's happening, creating interventions, and putting it into the marketplace where our audience is, and doing it in authentic voices, and doing it in a way that is not judgmental in the case of the COVID vaccine. And so that just shows that we need to do much more analysis, much more research, because this is a relatively new field, and understanding this Latino community, there's going to be so many things that we could borrow and learn for the rest of the country.
Yeah. That's what I know. We have the second video for Adriana if we want to take a look at it.
Yes, please. She was, to me, the most moving.
I was scared at first to get the vaccine because it was all new. But I decided to take it because I was tired of seeing a lot of people dying from COVID. I personally know more than 10 people that died from COVID, and it's terrible. Most of the people dying in this community, they're like me. The vaccine didn't hurt at all. It was just a little bit sore on my arm, but that's nothing. When I got the vaccine, I feel free.
Amazing. And I'm wondering something that you said in why this work of like people looked authentic to folks, and what is it about these messengers that makes them authentic, do you think? What does authentic look like for Latino community in ways that work for these types of ads?
It's a bit kind of like the evolution of how we use celebrity. When we first launched 16 years ago, they were very much our front and center. And that was because we were living during a different time where people would look up to the celebrity. Now people want to have access to information in a different way from people that they feel they can trust. It goes back to this idea of authentic voices and being peer-to-peer. And that is the currency of disinformation. And we basically have to co-opt it for the currency of the real information. And that's what we're experimenting with right now. But if I mean, Adriana moved me because you could tell she wasn't an actress. There was no music in the background. I would say that this is actually the beginning of a new era, not just of COVID conversations, but political conversations to political campaigns, getting this granular sense that you actually understand, that this person that's talking to you actually quite understands what your experience is. I think in a time right now where we are feeling, I think, disconnected, you kind of want to talk to your neighbor, and Adriana is very much your neighbor. And I think that's what makes her so effective. Yeah.
Something I'm wondering also that I saw in these ads, you said you meet people where they are, and something we've heard in our own research is, people who are hesitant, who aren't there yet, have serious concerns, serious fears that folks want to address. How do you toe that line, these ads, of not repeating any type of misinformation, but still speaking to those fears or concerns that folks have?
Angelo, do you want to tell why don't you tell the folks about like your top 3 findings, and then I can go ahead and tell them like how we actually incorporated it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think here's a good example too, because it kind of ties in the findings with some that directly correspond to the question. So, for example, one of the big narratives that we were seeing in terms of disinformation was probably the biggest outside of the sudden death, which was a big spike early on, was just a suite of attacks on reproductive health. And the idea wasn't to get someone to think that, buy into some grand conspiracy theory. The whole idea was to prolong someone's hesitancy, right? So that they would just find some reason, I'll wait a little longer. That's the idea. You don't have to convert everyone to being a full-on, public advocate against vaccines broadly, or to buy into all of there are plenty of really ridiculous conspiracy theories. And I'm happy to go through any of them. They're just not as powerful. People who believe that stuff are very likely to be a part of it, right? It's about who's the persuasion. And so the reproductive health one was the most damaging. And in that case, it's not about fact checking at that point, right? People who were receiving this were hearing just this avalanche of anecdotes. This person was seeing a story in a group about how someone became sterile, they were no longer able to get pregnant, their reproductive cycles got messed up, like they started to have problems having a baby, all sorts of those horror stories. And they're unsourced, or they found studies, or someone did an analysis. But that creates a generalized feeling. So the worst thing you can do, go out there, is give someone a fact check and expect that to do it. And then you're also amplifying the misinformation from a credible source and paying to do so. So that's just not going to help. But a simple thing that was a simple recommendation, and Maria-Teresa have other examples, is we've been doing briefings for HHS and local governments. And one of the things a couple months ago that we said is, put pregnant women in some of your ads. You're doing all this messaging, just have them do it. Just have them talk about it. You don't even have to deal with the elephant in the room. You could actually that alone is a powerful visual, because it helps connect the messenger to the underlying sentiment that people feel. And just knowing that was a thing that was disproportionate compared to other attacks can inform all sorts of downstream responses and mitigations, which is we actually need to think about a little bit more deliberately in terms of who our actual messengers are. And separately, when we're producing content for local media, our talking points for experts that we go out there, that they also need to be mindful that this is a significant narrative that is percolating and taking hold. And I do think that's one really concrete example how seeing the disproportionate amount of attention that was given to that one set of attacks could start to be chipped away at piece by piece by putting together counter narratives that are also not solely designed and exclusively just to respond to that one falsehood, to your point.
And another question. So COVID obviously continues to be a huge public health crisis, and this summer shows that the crisis is not going away anytime soon, as many of us had hoped. But we also know that disinformation is targeted to heavily impact the midterm. So what do we know so far about any political disinformation? How is it connected to COVID? How do you see it evolving? What are the left's plans to deal with it?
I can jump a little bit on some of the narrative switches. I think that one thing that's starting to happen now is a pretty substantial shift into targeting parents more broadly. And this is directly targeted not just to Latinx audiences, but generally speaking. And the entry point can be anything: COVID, a lot of the critical race theory, like dire warnings, this idea that children are being taught to hate America, to not be patriots. that matters, because the whole idea gets back to, and when you put it together, is this idea that somehow America is no longer America, that you're not going to be free, that the power and control and freedom that you have has been eliminated, and that you're not going to be able to be a good parent, and that you get to make decisions, and you can be someone that opposes all these public health measures, and also but also be a good parent. That you have to actually, that it's not about any of the validity of the responses. It's only about who gets to make that decision for your child. And if you think about the fights ahead, like they're already fighting about the next fight, which is the next vaccination effort. Like they're done. They've declared victory in terms of mucking up how much of the conversation around vaccinations for adults. And the shift has already been focused on children and young people. And the way that they're doing that is by pulling in basically making it about parents. And so there's that fight brewing, which is going to be a thing. And then the corollary to that is a really intense escalation around the socialism attacks. And I think Maria Teresa really was such a good, she was just pounding the drum on how much that was damaging in the last cycle and how it needed to be grappled with in a meaningful way. It's gotten worse, and we just still haven't figured out a way to deal with that yet as a whole. Like that is a thing. And by worse, I mean this. Instead of it just being that these vague attacks on socialism, one of the consistently escalating narratives that we've seen is that somehow the president is in cahoots with the Chinese government, and that Democrats are, and so is the media, and that all of these little things, including taking away your parental rights when it comes to vaccination, is all part of turning America into a communist country. That communism is coming here, that all these little things are warning signs of communism, and that so you should be much more on guard and alarmed about any of these minor encroachments, because that if you let one thing happen, what you're basically doing is creating a slippery slope for communism. And I think those two things are going to be both the culture war front, but then also separately, the broader attack around socialism, communism are going to continue to be pretty powerful narratives that they're going to put more and more resources into.
Okay, so I think, Maria Teresa, anything you would add to that?
I think that the critical race theory is something that we should be very concerned with, because it is going to be the one that is going to try to splinter off Latinos. And that is where we have to be very careful. This idea that critical race theory, the way it's being presented right now, is being presented not in the totality of communities of color, even though it impacts the communities of color. And we're starting to see people trying to siphon off Latinos and create divides. And so the more we can get ahead of it and really explain what it is and what it means, this inclusivity of America and the totality of who we are, there needs to be more explanation, more resources to that. That is of concern of mine. The other one I would say is how they're increasingly, and Angelo, you talk about this, and this is where it sounds really wacky, but using the strong belief of the Latino community in religion, in protecting families and protecting children, you're starting to see an uptick of conversations that were very similar to the conversations. I don't know how many people followed it, but right after the 2016 election, there was a man who jumped in a car, drove from North Carolina to Washington, D.C., and went into a very popular pizza joint and ran downstairs, guns a-blazing, saying, guns in hand, saying that he came to protect and free the children that Hillary Clinton had enslaved, right? Yeah. It sounds kooky and wacky, but we're starting to see those conversations now take place when it comes to trafficking of children at the border. It is not true, but it is really hitting and resonating among Latinos of a particular set through the religious angle. And so we're going to have to figure out, how do we talk about that in a way that is, and this is what, the challenge with COVID is, and this is what we're learning, is that the more that you judge someone on their belief system, the more they disengage. And so our ability to communicate is going to have to become far more sophisticated to create spaces, even when the stuff that they're spewing is pretty bananas, right? Yeah. But you have, so there is a lot of work that has to be done, and we don't know quite yet how to tangle it, because normally what we would have done at Voto Latino was we would go to the church and the church would help us. But and the Catholic Church, I think, would help us. But I think the challenge is that we're seeing a mass exodus of Latinos going into the evangelical communities. And sadly, the evangelical communities espouse white nationalism, and it is a very different nut to crack. So it's incredibly complex. Our job at Voto Latino is to identify the information that Angelo is taking on the political front. We repackage it, we sell it, and we don't sell, we share it with the community to make sure that we're inoculating creating behavior. The reason that we are focused on this is because we do believe that the same people that are swayable voters, they're swayable for the vaccines, they're the ones that need to be best communicated to keep them engaged that their government is working, and then sending them back to make sure that they're participating in the midterm elections.
Yeah. I think we have a few questions that have come in while you both were sharing some of your very insightful answers. Maria Teresa, I think this is in reference to the example you mentioned by Prager University using that video of the Venezuela man. Lucy asks, Prager has been on the scene and amassed billions of views for quite a while, and we are only now building infrastructure to push back. How do we even begin to try to catch up to their incredibly effective propaganda machine?
Hi, Lucy. It's nice to see you here in this space. So I think that is the challenge, is that this is something that we've been short-footed. We have not been spending money. Had it not been for so many folks, such as Media Matters, that has been the watchdog of the right wing, it would have been completely undetected. I think the concern now is that we do need to create content, we need to create interventions, and we do need everybody involved. In our 2020 campaign, Voto Latino did not just rely on organic. We basically invested close to $34 million in the campaigns, both on the C3 and the C4 side on information. But then we also enlisted the help of influencers and corporations. I mean, we're really living in such an ironic time that our government, a democratic elected government, is increasingly questionable, and the faith of institutions are questionable. But when it comes to brands, people still really trust them. And so I do think that there's a space here to have where we bring in brands to talk about what's happening. And how do we do that? I mean, at Voto Latino, what we did very modestly, again, because we were trying to get through a 2020 election so that we could have a democracy, was that we worked very closely with for example, with Nike's affinity groups. But then we would actually then provide information so that they can share it with also their audience. So it was tested information that we knew would move them, that was neutral, that was giving people facts, but from Nike, not from your local election officials, right? And so that is where we are. And I do think that one area that we need to explore more, Lucy, is not just creating the content, but who are the people that can be those messengers?
If I can just jump on, I love that question. It's like a big thing for me. I think it is a question that we have to be asking ourselves a lot more. And I think, a lot of times people will, and defaults always say, well, it's not enough money, right? But there's plenty of money. I mean, Democrats spend $1 billion every cycle on TV ads, most of which they know are not going to work at all, right? So it's plenty of money. It's a matter of what are the metrics for success? And how are they thinking about the investment as a strategy? PragerU is not designed solely to just make Dennis Prager feel good. It is designed to create digestible content so that people can take ideas and then go evangelize them. And they have advantages. They have a cultural imperative. They have a culture of amplification imperative. When I see an idea, I take it, I echo it back. I mean, Rush Limbaugh's fans used to call themselves ditto heads. The idea was, I take what I hear, I echo it back to the world around me. They built that muscle memory and that reflex, and that is a part of their infrastructure. So that helps sustain these investments once they get it started. But ultimately, a part of it is actually putting money directly into the places of content creators. You're not going to have to build a parallel Fox News or Dennis Prager. We probably need 5 Dennis Pragers, because we actually have a much more diverse ideologically, geographically, in everything. I mean, we have a different type of coalition, and having a lot of storytellers that can actually communicate with their people is a big piece of it. Right now, it is very dry. And so some of it is just that we have to start. And it can seem very bleak, but the one thing we do have ultimately is they have to spend a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of resources to build this infrastructure and sustain it, and they still have to cheat. And that's because at the end of the day, to Maria Teresa's point, we still have the things that really can create culture shifts and paradigm shifts on our side. It's just they're not marshaled, organized, or leveraged effectively sometimes But we probably have the numbers, but they have something that is a lot scarier, which is the ability to marshal a hyper radicalized force by way of these communications infrastructure that they've created. One pillow guy that only sells to right wingers managed to basically spend 6 months doing nothing but attacking democracy in the United States, and has done a pretty significant damage to it just by selling pillows to the same people that are watching these Dennis Prager ads. So it is powerful, but it's just still a very small subset.
Yeah. We have another question from Aida. She says, this is a really interesting conversation. Thank you. What are some of the messages that did not work? I think it's in reference of the ads, which is an interesting question. What are some ads that you thought would work, but maybe didn't?
The biggest one was, so we had two doctors do the direct to camera, and both of them, when they were talking about how it was effective, how it had test trials, how it was this, that, it was too scientific. In fact, we had to drop the young Latina doctor who we thought was going to do fantastic because she was a community doctor. We actually didn't run the ad at all because it was really bad. Not that she was bad, it was just the receptive, it was bad. It was bad. But the gentleman, the one that was talking about, he was also a doctor, but then he turned it and flipped it and talked about wanting to see his grandkids again. And so that part was actually the third ad that we ended up showing. And it was the most effective between 18 and 29-year-olds because they wanted to see their abuelo again.
Sounds great. I think we have another question, the Q&A chat from Natalia Guzman. She asks, was creating ads in Spanish ever considered to see if that changed things?
We're doing those right now in market, and we're in conversations because we're actually going to be, we're right now in conversations with the state of New York to do exactly those type of things. But the reason we were trying to identify hesitant Latinos that were predominantly our demographic, but we are now testing those. We're about to go into field, but yes.
Yeah. And I saw on the participants, Jennifer Garza, I saw you had your hand up and I saw it went down, but if you want to put your question in the Q&A chat or in the chat, we'll make sure to get to that as well. I'm wondering for you both, what has surprised you in doing this work? And I know you've been doing it for a while, but like, what did you discover that you previously didn't know?
I could go first. I could just say that.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
The reaffirmation of how little effort there is to curb the information that Latinos consume, even though we are such a large marketplace. Angelo often talks about how there could be an ad that is on Facebook that will be taken down in English, but it won't be taken down in Spanish. I can say the same thing. There's radio hosts in Miami right now spewing harmful information, but because the FCC doesn't seem to speak Spanish, they continue to stay up and create harm. And so I think that what is always, I mean, from the work that I do, I think one of the challenges is always recognizing that even though we are the second largest population in this country, we are always underserved in a way that causes harm for the community, but also for the country. And until we recognize that this should not be a side project, but this should be a mainstream project where everybody should care, because the repercussions of that, just the basic health of the Latino community would be felt ricocheted across the country. But also, if we don't have recognizing that we're also the petri dish of bad information that could also be so corrosive, there should be much more attention to be paid. And as Angelo said, we have to meet our audience where it is, and we have to figure out how to stop funding ads that only target a certain group of people that make a lot of people money, but is actually not effective in curbing and disseminating information. We as a country have to reimagine the priorities when we look at the Latino community, because we are no longer a subset, and we are making a lot of determinations. And it is always shocking, even though I've been doing this for a long time, to see how little resourced we are, and yet how much we're expected to carry forward.
I would say for me, the surprising thing was the influence of local Spanish language, in particular, talk radio. It's like we knew it existed. It's always been a part of the landscape, but looking at local talk radio is not a thing that really is a difference maker when it comes to the broader traditional media landscape. It's relevant to the problem of misinformation, but it's not really, it's usually an amplifier. It's down the stream. It's after the story has already spread and they tend to echo it back. That's just not the case with Spanish language talk radio. Consistently, all the research is the more resources we put into this, the more we find that they're taking kernels of things that they're seeing in their WhatsApp groups or online, and they're breathing life into it in a way that not just helps it directly spread to their audience, but then spread beyond those the community that they directly speak to. And that's a new, that was surprising, and it shouldn't have been, but it was. And it's going to be a unique challenge because those are not players in the landscape that are traditionally, like, it's easy to say, wow, you have to do something about Sean Hannity or Tucker. Look how big and odd their audience is. Look how substantial they are. They're in the conversation. You know, you think about who you know, and that's how you would just assess the threat. And in this case, it's really different. And that was, I think, surprising, was just the sheer influence that some of these Spanish language talk radio hosts can have in taking something that's been percolating and really helping breathe life into it and having it spread beyond just their audience.
We have another question from Aida. Just one more question. What can public health departments learn from all this work? How can they use it? Which is an interesting question. Any resources that they can tap into, or how is your network helping public health departments?
Well, I know that Angelo has done a lot of briefings with HHS. I could share with you some of the first briefing that we learned that we did with HHS was that it turned out that younger Latinos were highly dependent on older Latinos for their health information, even around COVID. When you think about it, it makes sense that they're most likely to be uninsured and the most likely to be healthy, so they don't go to a doctor. So there's no medical professional. And so having conversations as a medical health professional and recognizing that if you're speaking to la abuelita, you know, we're multi-generational families, have the conversation of, have you talked to your grandson about this or your granddaughter about this, right? And having that kind of interaction. We think that that we helped influence, when we shared that data shortly after, the vice president had that Instagram live with Olivia Rodrigo, right? That wasn't by coincidence. It was the data that was showing that young people were the most hesitant and they needed an influencer to meet them where they were. But I do think that there's tons of learnings on the health front, but it's a matter of, again, who's the messenger and how do you get that information to them? But I'm sure, Angelo, what else? You have other stuff, I'm sure that is.
I mean, the only thing I would add on the public health department specifically is that, like, a lot of fighting misinformation is the same things you think about when you're fighting viruses. You know, I mean, think about it. When a piece of content or a video gets a lot of views, we say it's going viral. A lot of information and misinformation spreads in ways similar to a virus would. And that means, from a public health department perspective, the things that really matter and can be influential is understanding the broad context that's happening out there when you're doing messaging. The second is early warning and early intervention. So being able to identify a damaging narrative or a piece of disinformation early does require that it makes a difference. Fighting it after it's already spread is going to be a lot harder than dealing with it early on. And those two things, I think, are really critical pieces. And that means that it can inform a whole range of communications, conversations. You can get ahead of stuff. You can inoculate against it. And that's the third piece, that the more people in the public discourse that are confident and aware, that's like the equivalent of having antibodies. You need more people to put friction in the system so that it's harder for disinformation to spread. You know, people that can say, when someone's saying something in a WhatsApp group, we'll never get to all of them. But if there are people in there saying, wait, that's nonsense, it's a fabricated story that came from this bad actor that's actually being funded by that foreign government, it's a lot easier for people to then put that into context when they know, oh, I'm being manipulated by that. Okay, put that to the side. That's irrelevant. But we need people to have that as a whole, and you don't get that, you know, unless it's a big team effort. So that's what I would say about public health officials is that piece.
Yeah. That's a really great way to close the webinar today, and a really great analogy of using people being informed and empowered as the antibodies for the damage that all of this causes. Maria Teresa, Angelo, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate sharing all your insights, and we will be sharing with folks the recording for the session today and any resources that pertain to this session. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you. Bye-bye.